One of the most notorious men to have been executed inside of England during the medieval period was William Wallace, a key figure in the War of Scottish Independence. He was responsible for the defeat of an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, but then he fell into the hands of his enemies, and King Edward I of England decided to crush Wallace brutally inside of his capital city. He was dragged out in front of a crowd and was condemned to death for high treason, and was then hanged, drawn and quartered. But what is the story of his execution? Join us today as we look at William Wallace's execution, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Little is known about William Wallace's early life. However, as things were very tumultuous in Scotland following the death of King Alexander III, the Scots asked the English king, Edward I, to arbitrate in the succession crisis. He chose John Balliol, who was a puppet figure and was to be manipulated by the English, but the Scots got fed up with being ruled in a sense discreetly by the English. Some historians have claimed that Wallace may have even at one point fought for them, and for Edward I's army as a mercenary soldier, but he was described as a tall man with the body of a giant, with lengthy flanks, broad in the hips, with strong arms and legs, with all his limbs very strong and firm. He was then involved in a number of uprisings, and his first act was killing the English High Sheriff of Lanark, and they then raided Scone. He teamed up with Andrew Murray and defeated the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which was considered one of Wallace's finest moments. The Scottish army did, despite being outnumbered, rout the English, and as they crossed the north side of the river, the Scots attacked and caused chaos. Wallace was doing brilliantly commanding his army, and it was said that the bridge even collapsed across the river and that many of the English soldiers drowned. But this victory gave the Scots confidence, and following this Wallace was then given the title of the Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland. Wallace around winter 1297 began to conduct raids into northern England, but in April 1298 Edward I ordered another invasion into Scotland. It was a huge invasion, and the English plundered a number of towns, and Edward I regained a number of castles, but the English king then found that the Scots were camped nearby at Falkirk, and he then moved his army quickly to attack the Scots, and Wallace then, as the English got close, rearranged his army. However, at the time the English were deploying longbowmen, who were causing chaos with the Scots, and the English crushed Wallace's forces, with the Scots losing many men. Wallace managed to escape, but his reputation was damaged heavily. He then resigned as the Guardian of Scotland, and he went to France to ask for help against the English. However, by 1304 he was back in Scotland, and was being hunted by the English. On the 5th of August 1305, Wallace was handed over to the English, and he was now in the hands of his enemies, and with this he was taken to London and was brought to Westminster Hall, where he was placed on trial for treason. He claimed that as he was never a subject of Edward I, that he could not in a sense be convicted of treason, but he had been accused of atrocities against civilians, and that he did not even spare monks and nuns. He then was crowned with a garland of oak, and was referred to as the King of the Outlaws, but after his short trial he was then sentenced to death. But it was a terrible death that Wallace would experience. He was on the 23rd of August 1305 taken from the Hall to the Tower of London, where he was then stripped naked and was tied to the heels of a horse on a hurdle. He was then dragged throughout London, whilst the crowd cheered and hurled abuse at the Scottish rebel. He was to be hanged, drawn and quartered, and he was then taken to the Elms at Smithfield, where he came face to face with his executioner. Wallace was taken off the hurdle, and was then taken to the gallows, where he then had a noose tied around his neck, and he was then cut down from the gallows after he was almost dead. After this his ordeal got significantly worse, as he then had his private parts cut off, and these were burned in a fire in front of him, and following this the executioner cut him open, and Wallace then had his bowels and insides taken out and burned before him. Following this the axeman took his head clean off with an axe, and then cut the remains of Wallace into 4 pieces, and these were then sent north to be displayed to act as a significant reminder of King Edward I's power. But then Wallace's head was taken on a short walk to London Bridge, where it was dipped in tar and was then placed on a pike high above the bridge to remind Londoners of the threat that traitors brought to England. William Wallace experienced a brutal and terrifying death at the hands of the English and King Edward I. It was rare for a man from Scotland to be seen this far south in England, and in London the crowds jeered and screamed at the man that had in the past caused significant damage to the English army. Ultimately, Wallace is today seen as a heroic figure whose life has been documented in many different films, but his end in execution was one which was harrowing. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.